Welcome back to this final session, which is on soft power and public diplomacy. And if traditional closed-door diplomacy is inherently meant to be civil in manner, has public diplomacy added to or reduced civility between states? This roundtable discussion will delve into the issues of soft power and public diplomacy. We'll be looking at what is more effective in generating soft power. Is it a civil discourse between peoples of two countries or national image campaign? How might a state develop an attractive foreign policy through partnering publics at home and abroad? And can or might or should soft power-based world politics replace hard power in an increasingly regulated world? And Naren Chitty, Professor Naren Chitty of Macquarie University will chair this session. Naren is Associate Dean International of the Faculty of Arts at Macquarie University. He's also the Foundation Chair in International Communication and the inaugural Director of the Soft Power Advocacy and Research Centre at Macquarie. He served as the Secretary-General of the International Association for Media and Communication Research from 1996 to 2000. He's Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of International Communication. He was awarded the Order of Australia in 2009 for services to education, particularly in the field of international communication as a researcher and academic, and to a range of professional associations. Prior to joining Macquarie, he had a distinguished career as a public diplomat in Washington during the Reagan years. A policy planner in the area of national television and deputy director of an NGO in community development, starting as a UNDP young professional. He has a PhD in international relations. His primary focus of research is soft power and public diplomacy. He's an advocate of the ethical use of soft power, and his most recent co-edited book is under publication with the title China, the US and the World, Theatres of Soft Power. And I'm very pleased to now turn over to you, Naren, to introduce your panel.
Thank you, John. Because we are transitioning from the national to the international, I thought I will say a few words, provide a little frame which perhaps would allow that transition to happen more clearly, in a sense. I want to use the term makeup in 4 different senses to do this. This is to do with kinds of soft power and values of soft power. So the first use of the term makeup is really the definition of who we are or what a country is, and is related to the deep values of the country, the culture, and by that we would mean a whole range of things from civility in behavior to cultural industries and so on. Political culture, political values and the political system, and finally foreign policy. And the reason I put it in that way is that Joseph Nye has a kind of pyramid in which he has culture at the base, and then political values, political culture in the middle, and foreign policy at the top. And these are all areas where soft power is important. The second is, I would say, a second meaning for makeup here is beautification, coming from the cosmetic part of it. And this is related to accentuating the positive. The third, I use the term here, reciprocation. And here I would like to bring in some of the terms which have been used in the previous sessions, like partnerships, partnership building, community building, ethical and dialogical communication. And the final one is falsification, making up as being falsifying. And that's associated with for instance, the use of the term vilification, which somebody employed right at the beginning, in contrast with a civil language. So what I aim to do is to introduce each person in turn, beginning with Professor Jocelyn Chey, who has been a lecturer in Chinese studies at the University of Sydney, a diplomat, from 1973. For 20 years, she was with the Australia-China relations area in DFAT. She has held 3 posts in China and Hong Kong, including being Consul General in Hong Kong from 1992 to 1995. She was one of the key people involved in the Australia-China Council at the time of its founding in 1979. And from 88 to 92, she was director of the China branch of the International Bull Secretariat. Currently, she's a visiting professor at the University of Sydney and a consultant on Australia-China relations. And Jocelyn is going to be speaking today on soft power, public diplomacy, and cultural diplomacy, defining those terms, distinguishing between the 2 aims, that is to persuade and to engender mutual understanding and trust. And she's also going to highlight some of the problems in contemporary public diplomacy and possible solutions to them, including how to build consensus around national identity and whether soft power initiatives can ever compensate for lack of hard options. Jocelyn.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much to CHASS and to the organisers of this forum. It's a great privilege to be invited to join you this afternoon. As Professor Chitty has said, I'm going to start, as many other speakers have done, by trying to define some terms so we know exactly what we're talking about, but in a brief way, because we have other more distinguished speakers on this panel. So first of all, what do we mean when we talk about soft power? The term first came into general use after it was introduced into general discourse by Joseph Nye. And I think it can be, I would like to take the definition of it as the power of attraction. So not something which necessarily is promoted, but also involving the reaction or reception of that promotion. A traditional diplomacy might be roughly defined as government speaking to another government, or a government getting its message across to decision makers and opinion leaders outside the base country. Public diplomacy then is also used as part of traditional diplomacy, but in as a diplomacy that speaks to a wider section of the public, including and particularly the media. Cultural diplomacy I see as part of public diplomacy, but cultural diplomacy differs in that it speaks directly to the people. All diplomacy, all of these, are exercises in how to influence and persuade. And has been already pointed out, diplomats learn at nursery school that they have to speak in a civilized manner. So there's the connection with our earlier discussions about civility. That's not to say that diplomats are always civil. In fact, they also learn in primary school how to use harder language, harder messages, but to veil them under a cloak of civility. So a really skilled diplomat is one who manages to maybe to use humor to veil real insults. And there are examples that could be given of effective use of diplomacy. One that comes to mind was when I was working in China in 1970s, when Stephen Fitzgerald was our first ambassador there, and he had some background in Chinese studies and had been to the language school, but his language training had been confined to contemporary political and military type language. And this was known to his counterparts in the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they took absolute delight in saying to him, "Now you, Mr. Ambassador, we know that you are a scholar in Chinese, so you will understand me when I say," and then they would quote a proverb in classical Chinese, and he had to dig me in the ribs and say, what were they saying about that? Because they knew the limits of his language ability and that he wouldn't actually understand what they were saying. There's a point scoring. Point scoring is fair, both on the sporting arena and also in the diplomatic field. So cultural diplomacy, what is that about? It may be, and usually is, an attempt to promote the image of a people or a nation or a culture. Because if you are not known, if you're not recognized, then you don't have any ability to promote the actual message that is involved in a regular diplomacy. So I thought a very good example of that was mentioned this morning in the quote from Tim Winton. Will you look at us by the river? Will you look at us by the river? Surely that could be summarized, that could sum up what is the exercise in cultural diplomacy. In fact, many of the issues discussed earlier today also apply to diplomacy and to international relations. And I think particularly of what Paula Aboud and Tom Calmer had to say about the importance of civil discourse and national identity, particularly for those people who are marginalized within our own society. So equally in international discourse, there should be an attempt to recognize other people's identity and to speak to them in terms of respect, as Ross Croucher meant, that being the hallmark of a civil discourse. So cultural diplomacy can be then this centered attempt to project an image, but it can also be an attempt to enhance mutual understanding through cultural exchange and dialogue. And these two objectives are not necessarily mutually incompatible. While this is the aim of UNESCO and associated international cultural bodies, it may also be part of may also be a national goal for a country that is engaged in cultural diplomacy. And an important message, I think, to take home is that this kind of mutual understanding through cultural exchange and dialogue also can have practical effects, because it can spur creativity and innovation, which have also been mentioned earlier today. So I think Australia is in a unique and very valuable place in the world because we are surrounded by other countries and other civilizations with different cultural backgrounds and different cultural traditions. So if we can develop our cultural exchanges with these countries, it will have the add-on effect for us of building up creativity and innovation in Australia. And really that's how we should be promoting the importance of this exercise. So what about this international image which cultural diplomacy is trying to project? Well, that image can be carefully crafted. A country can decide that they wish to have a certain image internationally, or it may come about by accident or as a result of some incidental flow-on effect of some other policy. Just to give you an example, I think one country which carefully crafts its image is New Zealand. And they do it by a coordinated approach to marketing. So New Zealand products which you see around Asia are always carefully identified with that beautiful fern image that they have, and people will have already received the message that New Zealand products come from a clean, green country. And this is very well done by this coordinated attempt back in New Zealand. But then, as I say, this image may also be one that comes about accidentally or is influenced by an accidental event. So I think, for instance, of how Japan's image suffered as a result of the earthquake and nuclear disaster there, which flowed on to people seeing Japan as a dangerous country, as a country that was committed to sort of adventurism and where there was too much acceptance of government propaganda that said, don't worry, you know, everything will be all right. And that really affected Japan's international standing. And they're still dealing with the consequences, which came about, as I might say, accidentally. A country's international image may come about through international media which project an image which is not the one that is desired. And there, you know, for instance, North Korea. I mean, everybody would say, North Korea. But the image of North Korea is actually one which has been built up by the international press as much as by the actions of the North Korean government. Not that I'm defending them, but it would be very hard for any North Korean government now to escape that established image that they have in the international media. Anything that they say is immediately given the sort of worst possible interpretation. And an international image can also come about because it is consequent to policies or events that were not intended to have an international impact, but do. So Australia, for instance, at the moment, if you travel outside Australia, you will be questioned as to, you know, why we are a country which has compulsory detention for asylum seekers. This really has affected our international standing. Why we are a country where Aboriginal people still suffering from disadvantage after 200 years of settlement. These are things which were not intended to have an international impact, but do have. And a government has to learn to deal with all of these, whether they are accidental or media-generated or the result of domestic policies. All of that will be part of our public diplomacy. And another aspect of this projection of an international image is one that's also been mentioned earlier today. That is, you have to start with agreement as to what exactly you are promoting. What is your national identity? If you don't have agreement on what national identity, national values are, then it's very hard to have a consensus about how they should be promoted. And here I would like to move on to the second part of my talk, which is quite brief. And it results from the fact that when I was approached to take part in this forum, I was just about to set off to do a month's research in Taiwan. Now, why Taiwan? Because most countries' soft power, or this cultural diplomacy, is an add-on to the regular diplomacy. But Taiwan, once countries such as Australia shifted their recognition from Taipei to Beijing, they lost that regular diplomatic network. They lost their place in the United Nations. They have to rely on public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy in a sense which other places, I can't call Taiwan a country, that's typical, you see, but I can't, other places cannot do. So I thought it would be interesting to look at how Taiwan was using and applying public diplomacy. And what did I find? First of all, they have a problem about their national identity, because you had the current government, which is in the tradition of saying Taiwan is Chinese, although it may have particular Taiwanese characteristics, but they are the government that came across from China, and they emphasize the Chineseness part of their national identity. And an opposition which is busy saying, but we are Taiwan, we are different. We are not necessarily part of China. We should be building up an image of Taiwan which is completely separate. And these, because they have a democratic system and they have this very feisty but confined debate within the media and in Parliament is a matter which still remains to be resolved. However, they do agree on some things. And what they agree on most and above all is, first of all, that they are a democratic place and that they have a multicultural basis, which includes the Aboriginal people of Taiwan and the local people of Taiwan, as well as the more recent immigrants from China and from Southeast Asia. But what I found also most interesting when I was there is that they have a very particular definition of what culture is to be promoted. Only last year did they form a Ministry of Culture, and therefore only last year did they develop cultural policies. And their new Minister of Culture is a very feisty lady who comes from a journalist, writer background, called Lung Ying Tai. And when I went to the Ministry of Culture, they gave me their brochure, which tells me about what the ministry is and what they seek to do. And instead of having the national flag on their brochure, they have this rather charming picture of morning glory, we would call it. They explain this by saying that morning glory grows in the soil. So culture, first of all, should be something which comes up from the people. It's not imposed by the government. And then they also quote their minister, who defines culture as the way that people treat each other on the street. For instance, the quote says here in their brochure, if you're walking on the street and there is a branch hanging down from a tree, do you break it off or do you walk round and avoid it? If you are crossing the road with a blind person, do you give that person a hand to cross the street, or do you go across yourself and leave that person to make his or her own way? And it is, when you go home at night, do you feel good about the way that you have been treating other people? Do you feel good within yourself? This is what we mean by culture. So really, their definition of culture is civility. And that's why I found that it was a particularly interesting and, I think, apposite to our debate this afternoon. So where does that leave us then when we look at these big questions that we've been asked to consider as a panel? And I think the first point I'd like to make is that we need to take an altogether attitude to the question of civility. When we are considering domestic policies, which we've been talking around for most of the day, we should also look at what are the international effects and implications of those policies. We should also use every possible means to promote our image, and that involves not just governments sending out a message or promoting through sending arts troops overseas, but we want to use our standing as a good citizen and to use that power of attraction that comes about through involving all people in this effort. In other words, we should recognize the importance of soft power. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Chey brings in a great deal of experience in the practice of diplomacy, as well as her academic perspectives, and we're privileged. So too with Professor the Honourable Gareth Evans, who has actually led diplomacy and public diplomacy in the past. He's currently Chancellor of the Australian National University. He is President Emeritus of the Brussels-based International Crisis Group. He was from 2000 to 2009. He's been in Australian politics for 21 years, 13 years in the cabinet. Foreign Minister from 88 to 96. He has 9 books, and many, many publications, 100 journal articles. The most recent book is The Responsibility to Protect, Ending Mass Atrocity Crimes Once and for All. In 2011, Foreign Policy magazine cited him as one of the top 100 global thinkers for 2011. And he's also been awarded the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute Four Freedoms Award for Freedom from Fear. Professor Evans is going to be speaking about the whole range of questions that we have outlined in the program.
Well, Naren, Chitty, John Simons, my very distinguished panellists, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Last week's very uncivil series of happenings in Australian public life, which I'm not surprised to hear have already occupied some attention in earlier sessions of this forum, are really about as unhappy an example of a country's negative soft power at work that I can remember. If we accept, as I do for working purposes, the definition of the originator of the soft power idea, Harvard's Joe Nye, as has been spelled out by Naren Chitty, namely that the soft power of a country rests primarily not only on its foreign policies when they're seen as legitimate and having moral authority, but also on its political values when when the country is seen to live up to them, both at home and abroad, and also its culture, the places where that's seen as attractive to others. If you adopt that approach, it will be evident that last week we struck out rather badly. To take just one piece of media evidence of that, and unhappily there are many more, the enormously influential blog of the United States-based magazine Foreign Policy, foreignpolicy.com, ran a piece last Thursday headed Australia's Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Sexist Week, describing in, that was the heading, describing in comprehensive detail for its worldwide readership the crass Julia Gillard menu affair, the almost unbelievably disgraceful Howard Sattler interrogation of the Prime Minister on her partner, the clumsy sexist joke of the Socceroo coach, and the latest sex scandal to engulf the Australian Defence Forces. About the only thing in the piece for which we can be pathetically grateful was that its focus was just on that week and on sexism and not the almost equally ugly series of manifestations of racism, casual or otherwise, the King Kong jibe and all the rest, which disfigured our public life in the previous 2 weeks and really did make many of us wonder, for all the giant strides we've taken towards making Australia a genuinely multicultural society and one that's both proud and respectful of our Indigenous Australians, made us wonder whether we've really made very much progress at all. In the 25 years now that I've been actively engaged in international affairs, I've never doubted for a moment, like Jocelyn, that a country's general image, how it projects itself, its culture, its values, its policies, and how in turn it's seen by others, is of quite fundamental importance in determining how well a country succeeds in advancing and protecting its national interests. It matters in determining whether it's seen as a good country to invest in and trade with, to visit, to study in, as a good country to trust in security terms, as a good country to support in international positions and in responsible international decision-making forums, as a country good to work with in solving transnational issues, problems that are beyond the capacity of anyone to solve by themselves. It's not the only thing, of course, that matters in diplomacy. Hard power, raw military and economic might has always mattered and always will, however much its salience might be diminishing, and I'm something of an optimist in this respect, in a world ever more conscious of its interdependence. Again, the credibility of particular policies, and not just the general credibility of the country as a whole that's advancing them, will, of course, always matter. And the individual personalities of particular leaders, which may be quite at odds, for better or worse, with the prevailing general image of that country's people, will often matter much more than international theorists, for one, like to concede. But all that said, a country's general image does matter, and I think it's critically important for the middle powers. Those of us who, while by no means insignificant in the global scheme of things, by definition are never going to be big enough and strong enough militarily or economically to demand of others that our interests be accommodated, but rather have to depend overwhelmingly on our capacity to persuade and to work cooperatively and constructively with others. And in international diplomacy, as in life itself, being seen to be inherently decent, being seen to be empathetic, being seen to understand and willing to accommodate the interests and values of others to the maximum extent possible, being seen to be constantly searching for common ground rather than just standing selfishly, defiantly, unthinkingly on one's own ground. These are the keys to being persuasive and being able to work cooperatively and constructively with others. Much closed-door diplomacy is necessarily going to have to go on being closed-door, and much of its effectiveness is going to go on depending, as always, on the professional skills of diplomats like Jocelyn and the quality of the briefs that they're working with. But general perceptions of the kind of country one's dealing with are really part of, a very important part of the total chemistry, the total tapestry, if you like, which should never be overlooked or underappreciated. If I had any success at all with some of the initiatives in which I was involved as Foreign Minister, I think it had a lot to do with the image which I was able very confidently to communicate of Australia as a confident, creative, energetic, young country, very comfortable in its new multicultural skin, and having a growing sense that its future would be determined, sorry John, much more by its Asian geography than its Anglosphere history. One of the particular images on which I was able to draw was that, interestingly, of Australia's military peacekeepers for the UN and elsewhere, who then, as now, had and have a fabulous reputation among professionals around the world and just about every local community in which they've ever served, for being competent, unshirking, cheerful, and above all, whatever the racial or ethnic or religious or caste context, being totally, instinctively, irreverently egalitarian, neither sucking up nor kicking down. The critical thing to appreciate about the projection of the values and the instincts about which I've been talking, the key elements, in other words, of soft power and what we more traditionally call public diplomacy, is that, and Jocelyn Chey made this point very well, it's not just the preserve of governments, and it doesn't just depend on the work of governments. The target, after all, was not just other governments, but in a sense, whole other populations. And the vehicles for projection are not just our own governments, but, in a sense, all of us. Of course, it's a forlorn hope that all of us behave as ideally as we should all the time. But if enough of us behave well enough, most of the time, through all the innumerable ways in which communities interact with each other internationally, it does make a difference. There are a whole range of contacts through travel, business, the arts, sport, academia, professional associations, service clubs, community action groups, which occur without any government involvement at all. And these contacts do add texture and depth, for better or worse, to community perceptions about what kind of country we are. And in many ways, I think they do matter much more than specifically designed public diplomacy campaigns. It is the case that some well-targeted and executed campaigns, like that which occurred a couple of years ago around India under the leadership of our then High Commissioner Peter Varghese, who is of course himself of Indian origin, to counter the impact of the highly negative reporting around India of some acts of violence against Indian students in Australia. Some such campaigns have made a difference, but I've long had reservations, perhaps a few more than Jocelyn, we could talk about this, about self-conscious general image promotion campaigns, which can consume vast amounts of resources for not very obvious returns. The last point that I'd emphasise about public diplomacy and soft power, and this brings us back to where I began, is that of course this is not just about the behaviour of, or the activities of Australians abroad in their direct interaction with other communities, but it's about the behaviour of Australians at home and how this is reported abroad in our ever more communicative world. Hugely embarrassing behaviour of the kind that we've seen here in the last few weeks, most of which has been mercilessly reported abroad in both traditional and social media, does have a negative impact on our soft power abroad. And it's important for that reason alone, quite apart from all the self-evident domestic reasons, that this kind of behaviour doesn't become the norm or be seen to be the norm. How we address that behaviour, how we restore, maintain decency and civility in our public and community life is what this whole day's forum has been about. And there are many dimensions to the answer. My own instinct, and I'll focus just on one of them, my own instinct is that one of the crucial factors is, and always has been, the quality of political leadership. How our political leaders conduct themselves in their relations with each other and in leading the national policy debate, what they identify and are articulate about as tolerable and intolerable behaviour, and how well their own behaviour actually reflects those standards. There are some, of course, who might be inclined to suggest, and Bronwyn Bishop could conceivably be among them, that during my own years in this place, I might on occasion have been rather less good at practising what I'm now preaching. But if we can't always get these things right, at least we should try. And my fear is that if Australia is going to be the kind of decent civil society most of us want it to be, and to leverage that civility and decency in a way that really does matter as international soft power, our current generation of political leaders is really going to have to try a little bit harder. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Evans, for that splendid contribution. I now would like to introduce the Honourable John Winston Howard, former Prime Minister between March 1996 and November 2007. He's been a Member of Parliament for 33 years and was Treasurer in an earlier government. He has an assortment of medals, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award in the United States, awarded by President George Bush in January 2012. And Mr. Howard is going to address examples of soft power used by Australia, as well as the issue more generally.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, to my fellow panellists. Ladies and gentlemen, when I was invited to make a contribution to this forum and given a designated topic, I reflected on an experience I had as Prime Minister, which in a sense drove home to me what will be my central thesis in my brief presentation, and that is that any nation's outward reach to the rest of the world, and particularly a middle power such as Australia, must include a combination of soft power, traditional diplomacy and hard power as commonly understood. And I don't want to get into a definitional debate. I have no real quarrel with Professor Nye's tripartite, three-pronged rather, description of soft power, its reliance on culture, its reliance on political institutions and the formal projection of foreign policy. But the incident that I recall was when I visited the province of Aceh in Indonesia some weeks after a couple of weeks after the terrible tsunami of 2004 and 2005. And I saw a sight that drove home to me that combination. there were young army engineers clearing the drains in order to get in the hope of getting clean water flowing again, discovering in the process quite a number of dead bodies. I came upon a water purification plant that had been deposited by those engineers on the first day that they had arrived in the province, and that water purification plant meant that the local hospital was operational because, as all of you will know, the greatest threat to human life after a disaster such as that are waterborne diseases because of the contamination involved. Here was a splendid demonstration to me of soft power. The first people to provide assistance in the wake of that tsunami were the military forces of Australia and the United States. And here were some young army engineers doing what could only be described as very distressing work. The water purification plant was keeping the hospital going, and if you wanted to think of a way in which, in those circumstances of the time, you wanted to leave a powerful impression of good and goodwill and decency with the local population, I could not think of a better one. And of course, the work was being carried out by the members of the Australian Defence Force, who, as a category, have been unfairly denigrated in recent times because of the behaviour of some, and in that sense, let me very squarely identify with the splendid op-ed piece in today's Australian by Major General Jim Molan. I don't, as I said earlier, disagree with the definition that Joseph Nye has provided. And I can think of several examples of where the soft power of this country has not only augmented, but in fact replaced the efforts of those at a level of political leadership and also of formal diplomacy. Perhaps, in my experience, the best example of that was the soft power of the Colombo Plan and what has followed it. Colombo Plan, as you know, started in the early 1950s and has been over the decades, and its successes, one of the very best things that this country has done to transmit to the nations of our region our decency, our goodwill and our outreach. As Prime Minister, in common with my predecessor Paul Keating, I didn't enjoy a particularly good relationship with the former Prime Minister of Malaysia. Dr Mahathir was a difficult person. He didn't seem to like many people very much at all, particularly Prime Ministers of Australia and foreign ministers as well, that's right. He didn't like anybody and very much at all. As a consequence, it made interaction by our diplomats, it made interaction by our ministers and our Prime Minister difficult. But one always had the sense that below the surface there was nothing fundamentally wrong with the relationship. And that once he was replaced by somebody who was a little friendlier to our country, things would improve. And that, of course, did happen. And it's no accident, of course, that proportionately speaking, the alumni, I think this is still the case, the alumni of Australian universities as a proportion of the Malaysian population is probably the greatest in the world. And I think that was certainly the case some years ago. I'm sure there are people here, if I'm wrong, will correct me, but whether it remains the greatest, it is still very, very high. And I have no doubt that the influence of that in so many layers of Malaysian society, within the business community, within their formal diplomatic services, within their military services, all made an enormous contribution. I think it is important, if a nation is looking at its influence assets, which is a general way in which you can gather soft power, diplomatic professionalism, and on occasions hard power. It's important to start from a position of cultural self-belief. There's not much point in a country going around the world in some doubt as to whether it really believes in itself. And I found when I was Prime Minister, I continue to find too many overtones of people being doubtful as to whether they really believe in this country's history and what this country represents. That doesn't, of course, suggest for a moment that anybody should have a starry-eyed view about some imaginary, unblemished history, but rather a recognition that in the generality of circumstances, this country has got more things right, is fundamentally a democratic, tolerant, outward-looking society, wanting to make friends with not only those that have been part of our history, but those that have loomed a lot larger in our present day circumstances than once was the case. Drawing again on the experience of my own as Prime Minister and some of the circumstances where we interacted with our near neighbours, I draw again, of course, on the example of the intervention in East Timor. East Timor was again a combination of those three things. Certainly the work that was done at a diplomatic level, not only at a head of government level, which I was directly involved in enlisting the support and the participation of regional countries so that the force that went into East Timor was not seen as overwhelmingly a Western white force and therefore made up predominantly or only of Australians and New Zealanders, but included very significantly and therefore very successfully contributions from Korea and other nations in the region, but also the diplomatic work that was done not only by our own Foreign Minister and our Ambassador in Jakarta, but also in New York at the United Nations, ensuring that an appropriate resolution was passed by the Security Council. And of course, the skill with which the leader of the Interfet force, Major General Peter Cosgrove, interacted with his Indonesian counterpart, General Shanakali, in the early days of the intervention, played a major part in ensuring that the intervention went successfully. It's forgotten because it was seen as a successful intervention without loss of life. It's forgotten that it could easily have gone in another way. And if a rogue element of the Indonesian militia had attacked an Australian patrol and inflicted a number of casualties in the first 2 days, then the public perception would have been different. Now, these are examples of where all of those influence assets that we have were working together. And why, in responding to the, I suppose, thought prompters that were provided for this part of the forum, it's difficult to talk in terms of one form of power use replacing another. For a nation such as Australia, we will always need to have all of those influence assets working in harmony. We need a high-level diplomatic service. And I think Professor Chey was right to make that point at the outset. And my experience is that this country has been very well served by the quality of its diplomatic service. And I'm sure that's something that many people on both sides of politics in this country would attest to. We also need, of course, to understand that governments can make decisions which are designed to reach out positively to our neighbours, or indeed to people from in any part of the world, but it requires civility and decent treatment of them, of people who might come to this country to ratify, as it were, the gesture of goodwill of the government. And I think, for example, that one of the greatest assets this country has is its attraction to students in our part of the world. I think it still remains the case that amongst Chinese students, Australia is still the preferred destination. Not only is this an enormously valuable asset to Australia from an economic point of view, at one point a few years ago, about 15% of the revenue of Australian universities was coming on average from overseas students, which is an extraordinarily valuable asset, but it's also an incredibly valuable cultural asset, as I tried to highlight in relation to the experience that I'd had in Malaysia. So let me draw my thoughts together and say firstly that I don't think it's an either-or situation. You have to have those three outreach assets working in harmony. You need a skilled and professional and active professional diplomatic service, appropriately deployed, and people will argue about that from year to year, from government to government. You certainly need to maintain a credible military capacity because sometimes, and the former Foreign Minister will recognise this in relation to his experience with the Cambodian peacekeeping mission in his time as Foreign Minister, that what made that exercise credible was not only the skillful diplomacy and the peacemaking exercise, but also the military capacity that was able to give force and effect to the diplomatic work. And finally, of course, you do need to have an attitude and of mind and a culture which is outgoing and designed to convey a good impression. Can I finish by just saying something about the media? I think it's important that we understand that it can cut both ways. The media presentation of Australia is sometimes negative. Media presentation of other countries is often not negative at all because they don't have a tradition of a free media. And I've often been struck on my visits to Asia that the most compelling difference between China and India is the media. India has a genuinely robust, I might dare say, larrikin media. Sure, there was some very negative media reporting in relation to the treatment of Indian students several years ago, and I have no doubt that some of that media reporting was properly based, but it was monstrously fanned by the sensational character of the Indian media. Of course, in contrast, China is very different. I simply leave you with the observation there is still not much doubt as to which approach we here in Australia would prefer a country to have. For all its pain, for all its extravagance and for all its irresponsibility, let us have the freewheeling larrikin behaviour of the Indian media any day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. Do you have those insights from a former Prime Minister? Very difficult to come by, so to be much valued. Next, we have Professor John Siracusa. He's an Associate Dean of International and Justice Studies at RMIT. He's also Professor of Human Security and International Diplomacy in the School of Global Studies, Social Science and Planning at that university. His areas of interest have been nuclear history, American diplomacy, and presidential politics. And he's a regular commentator on Australian media. He's written a history of United States foreign policy, also a book entitled Depression to Cold War, A History of America from Herbert Hoover to Ronald Reagan, Presidential Profiles, The Kennedy Years, Real World Nuclear Deterrence, diplomacy, a very short introduction, so quite prolific. Professor Siracusa.
It's been a long time since I followed a prime minister and a foreign minister. This is a very special panel. 40 years ago, Zelman Cowan tapped me on the shoulder in New York and asked me if I wanted a job in Queensland. Went to the bookshops. I said, sure. And I never didn't know where it was. I'd only seen On the Beach and The Sundowners. That's all we knew about it. And my first boss when I got to Queensland was Gordon Greenwood, who's a very famous fellow, started international relations in this country. He was a student of Harold Lasky. And I said to Gordon, am I here at a good time? And I had arrived 6 weeks after Mr. Whitlam was elected. He says, you've come at a very interesting time. And in the last 40 years, and I started when Australia had 13 million people and a positive image overseas. It now has 23 million people 40 years later and still a positive image overseas. The diplomacy of this country has been conducted by professional class people generated by the best universities in Australia, so you've been well served over those years. I'm a little confused sometimes between I, we, and you. My wife says people will think you forgot your medicine. In fact, I'm an Australian citizen for the last 25 years, so I lapse into I, we, and you when I talk about the United States and Australia. Now, everybody has left me a clear field to talk about public diplomacy. Public diplomacy, of course, is a core aspect of people's diplomacy around the world, but it's about culture, indigenous culture, it's about sports, it's about Nicole Kidman and that kind of thing. But it's also about something else. Ed Gullion, at the Foreign Service Officer at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, coined the word in 1965. And he said public diplomacy is reaching out directly to people rather than connecting with them through their governments. And he was saying that public diplomacy looks past the Havana Convention of 1928. It looks past the Geneva Convention of 1961, where diplomacy is confined from government to government. It's about what we want other people to think, not only about us, but to think about their problems. And public diplomacy isn't just sending some soccer team to a foreign country. Public diplomacy is when Barack Obama talks to young Israelis and tells them to stiffen their leaders, to be flexible in negotiations in the future. That's hardball public diplomacy. It's getting people to do what you want them to do or change their behavior or attitudes towards their own governments. And I'm sure in recent days, the Iranians did not bring a moderate into power because they're watching their own television screens. They're listening to the rest of the world talking to them, the Americans and probably the Australians and the rest of it. So public diplomacy is about individuals, and it's about getting people to talk to people about what you want them to think. And I asked Gullion in 1975 or something, I said, where'd you get this public diplomacy? And he said he got it from Richard Casey, who, when he went to Washington in 1940, made buddies with a guy called George Gallup, hired a publicist on his staff, commissioned a report in New York and found out Americans didn't know anything about Australia. And he actually got Gallup to start asking the questions. So, and he was conducting his own public diplomacy, reaching out directly to the American people and getting them to think more about getting their government to come to the aid of Australia in the event of war with Japan. And it's very clever stuff indeed. And I was surprised when Gullion said that, because Casey doesn't get that kind of a credit. The other thing, too, is public diplomacy is about transparency. It's about doing things in the open. So when you talk to foreign cultures, you want them to do what you want. And I think Australia does that pretty well. We have 750,000 to 1 million Australians who live abroad, and the Lowy Institute likes to tell us that we don't use them enough. We got all kinds of NGOs that start in Melbourne or Sydney and make their way across the world. They might not always complement the goals of the government of the day, but certainly they amplify them for everybody. And so I think the role of the Australian diplomatic service is to decide what links to make, what links to establish, and hopefully get people to say the right things, maybe to get the governments on the ground, get the people on the ground to change their minds about, get their governments to change their minds about things. So it's a very subtle thing. It's not just about soft power. Australia's got heaps of soft power. The attraction of Australia for Americans is enormous. One poll after the other, Americans said they'd like to migrate to Australia. Unfortunately, 84% return within 2 years, so that's another story. But Americans don't know much about Australia, but they have this positive image, and they've had it in the 40 years that I go back and forth. The only reason I write books about Australian foreign policy is because when I get to America, they don't want to hear about nuclear weapons or the Cold War. They want to know what's going on in Australia. So I wrote a number of books, and in my last book, Australia Looks to America, on Australian foreign policy, I complimented Gareth Evans for being one of the most effective foreign ministers in the history of the Commonwealth, and I praised the former Prime Minister for leaving a special indelible imprint on his foreign policy in his time in office. And isn't it good to say nice things about people you're going to meet? Sometimes, when you blast people and you run into them in an elevator, they want to punch you in the mouth. But I said very nice thing about both these gentlemen because they're very effective. But there's no substitute at the end of the day between a foreign minister who works closely with the prime minister of the day or a secretary of the state working very closely with the president of the day. I mean, foreign policy, at the end of the day, is made by these kinds of people with the use of the diplomatic corps and the media and everybody else. But it's a very complex business. Australia has a very small diplomatic footprint. Alex Oliver, who's not here, points out that Australia has the smallest amount of money and representation in the world among the G20. Well, but then, as many people in this panel talk about Australia punching above its weight, Australia has this enormous imagery abroad. I mean, a very positive image, even with all the nonsense. So our problem is, with all the generations of kids that come through me, and they all work in different parts of the world, is to realize that in this messy, uncertain, and this cruel world that we lived in, that Australian diplomats, that is the trainees, have to understand the peculiarities and the particularities of the world today. It's a very confusing and it's a complex place. So that's what the universities are for, is to serve us to enlighten these people. But I want to leave a little bit of time for questions here. I visited America last year with my Australian wife, and as we were leaving New Mexico to come back to Australia, we'd visited Kirkland Air Force Base, where my cousin's a colonel there. And the guy says to my wife, before we could leave the airport, he said, "Would you say something for me?" And she said, "What?" And he said, "Would you say the dingo took my baby?" Now, she's too young to know what the hell that means, so I'm a little irritated. I'm next. And he says, "Now you got to say something for me." He says, "I see your passport says Australian." I says, "That's exactly what it says." So he says, "You can't get past me unless you say Aussie, Aussie, Aussie." I said, "Christ, man, there are limits to nationality." I'm not very good at it, and my accent was terrible. But anyway, I want you to know that from the distance, Americans have this enormously positive attitude about Australians. I was with an American general one night, and Australian diplomats and some protesting types, and who were critical of American policy in those days. The deal was that if Australia is an ally of the United States, it's a nuclear target. So one of the critics says to the American general who was visiting my seminar, he said, "Oh, you're always buying Australian favors." And he says to him, "Lad, Christ, you can't even rent an Australian." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I thought there were possibly three important themes that ran through all of this. One was the role of people in soft power generation and public diplomacy, and the notions of civility coming into that, as well as participation. And another level, the question of the importance of identity and self-belief in one's history. There was also emphasis given to educational diplomacy very important, obviously, for CHASS. And both political parties are thinking in terms of new initiatives in that respect. There was also the identification of the need to have both hard and soft power capabilities. So you don't have one rather than the other, you need to have both. But at this point, I'd like to open up the floor for questions to the panel. Please, Chitty.
Thank you. I've refrained from asking questions for the whole of the day, but I know that if I don't get it in now, I won't get it in. These are slightly unusual questions in that I want to give a bit of background. In addition to my job here at CHASS, I'm the chairman of the Fulbright Commission here in Australia. And Fulbright program, the Fulbright Fellowship Program, grew out of the wreckage of World War II, and it was the brainchild of Senator Fulbright, who very much thought he was doing soft power. So while we have been exchanging scholars between Australia and the USA in both directions now for 60 plus years, and there's some real value in the research exchange and what we learn from one another, what we're really doing is basic soft power. We're making friends. And what we're really earning from that is inclusivity, acceptance, understanding, mutual respect. And those things, I think, are sometimes just as important as guns and planes and so on. And I guess this isn't a question at all, it's a speech. But I learned my lesson because I had the opportunity to, as Naren knows, to interview Joseph Nye on an ABC show. And I usually take those opportunities to show off as much as I can. And so I said to him, well, isn't the trouble with soft power the very fact that it's soft? And Napoleon, quoting Napoleon, that said that real power comes out of the muzzles of the big guns. And he looked at me and he said, he said, Napoleon said that. I said, yeah. And he said, how did things work out for him? And he said, I think soft power is equally important. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi, Chris Farnham, Stratfor Global Intelligence. I just wanted to ask a question where we see the issue of soft power and public diplomacy crossing over and combining. In the digital era, we're seeing what has been termed as the democratisation of information and possibly the democratisation of the media. When we see what used to be called in pre-internet times fringe groups such as WikiLeaks or actors such as Bradley Manning and now Mr. Snowden making a space for themselves on the public stage and also trying to make a space for themselves inside Parliament and inside the workings of government, are we seeing technology force a change on governments and how they see public diplomacy? And I'd like to know what the panellists might think about the future of public diplomacy and the relationship between governments and the people in light of a greater voice for people before that may not have had a voice at all.
Who would like to go first?
It's not my question, I think. I think it's
Well, I suppose just a couple of things to say. One is the democratisation of the media, the socialisation of the media has leveraged up the sheer quantity of communication that is out there, and the sort of things that might have got an embarrassing mention in the New York Times and other mainstream journals around the place in times past now go viral in publics at large, and both for better and for worse, but usually for worse. The things that go wrong do get leveraged up and out there, and this is bound to have an effect over time if there's any consistency in the way a country is seen to behave. That's on that side of the impact of the media, but the social media. The WikiLeaks stuff and so on itself, I've always had very mixed feelings about this as a diplomatic practitioner. On the one hand, you can't help but applaud proper high-minded whistleblowing that does expose things that governments want shut up, kept away from the public gaze, which manifestly ought to be out there. And one of the few very good things that did emerge from the WikiLeaks stuff was that expose of the shooting from a helicopter of unarmed Afghans, which was a classic cover-up situation. It was uncovered, and that deserves our applause. But I think ego and a lot of other things got in the way of it. Indifference to the implications for effective security intelligence operations, source protection and so on, made it, at the end of the day, I think in the WikiLeaks case, more of an ego trip rather than a serious-minded contribution to international public policy. And we have to be very careful accordingly about making martyrs and heroes of characters who've got problematic motivations. But it's a delicate path to walk your way through on this, and I don't come out with resounding applause or condemnation. It's a matter of recognising that it's a conduct of international relations that is a subtle and complex business, and it is important, just one remaining point I guess, that there not be gratuitous exposure of communications and so on that go on between diplomats in the field and policymakers at home, not only in the context of sensitive negotiations, but other things generally, because you simply can't, any more than you can conduct personal relationships in the spotlight of constant publicity, you certainly can't conduct international relationships. So it's absolutely not an unqualified, unequivocal good to have sunlight exposing every damn thing. It can be a very significant bad in the conduct of effective relationships.
I'd largely agree with that. You can't have a situation where it is impossible to have a confidential communication inside a government. That can be very much against the national interest. As far as Julian Assange is concerned, my reaction to him was not that of some, that he committed a crime. I'm still struggling as to find what crime he's committed. He's no hero to me. He won't be getting my vote if he runs as a Senate candidate in New South Wales. But he's no hero, and I think he's just an attention seeker of the worst kind. But I'm not saying that. I'm still struggling to see what crime he's committed. But as Gareth Evans said, it does put an obligation on the machinery of government to adjust to this new reality. It's not social, there's new communication, social media, it's not going to retreat. I mean, it's with us forever, and we just have to adjust our responses to it. And I'm old enough to remember the injunction of my elders that there are certain things should not be said on the telephone. People don't say that anymore. It's about saying something on the telephone now is much safer than the way in which people resort to the use of the social media.
I might just add to and support, in fact, what our other two panellists have said, and refer back to what Alex Oliver said earlier today about how young people today put a higher value on freedom of speech than they do on their civil rights to vote. And I think we have it is certainly an issue which is not going to go away, but it's something that needs to be addressed. I'm not quite sure how, but it's not just a domestic issue, it's an international issue, because this freedom of speech, I think, is something which is a value which is espoused by the young around the world, not only in Australia, but also in authoritarian regimes, and no doubt in Iran and in China and other places which are marked by a distinct lack of democratic values of all types.
Also, I want to say that the internet is not a game changer. It just increases the volume and velocity of information. The spread of information has always been empowered people to challenge their own regimes or other regimes. I mean, the telegraph and the telephone and the rest of it. The internet just changes the volume and velocity. It doesn't change the nature of the game. It'll never replace the Foreign Service or a good foreign minister or Secretary of State.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
Sanjaya Senanayake from the ANU. Thank you for the 4 wonderful talks. I arrived here not knowing much about soft power, but will leave here thinking it is very important, especially for a medium power like Australia. Knowing that, and that we have a number of resources, sports, music, film, a diaspora, NGOs, how well coordinated is soft power by the Australian government? And if it isn't, should there be a push to have more input from the Australian government in coordinating soft power?
Can I say no? I don't think the government should get involved in over coordination. Some of the best illustrations of soft power are the spontaneous behaviours of individual organisations. If I may draw again, forgive me for doing so, on the Chey experience. One of the other experiences I had on that visit was to see Father Chris Riley, a Catholic priest who runs a youth off the streets in Sydney, was looking after the newly orphaned children of Chey, most of whom, or all of whom, have been, to the extent that it was possible, raised in the Muslim faith, and he'd somehow or other been able to overcome the cultural resistance of the authorities to the idea of a Catholic priest setting up shop to look after newly orphaned kids, and he'd been able to do it. I don't think he'd sort of got an enormous amount of help from the government. I'm not saying the government was unhelpful, but the point is that his own motivation and his own unique characteristics, if he'd had to go through some kind of formal government coordination, it had been weeks before he had got there. So I'm very leery of governments of either political persuasion sort of getting involved, not because they lack goodwill or they do it badly. It's just better to have a spray of organisations and inputs to the projection of soft power.
Can I just add to that any attempt to coordinate the different sort of groups you're talking about would add new meaning to the old expression of herding cats. I mean, It's just not doable, so forget it. And nor should you try, basically, on first principles. That's the very nature of civil society, that government ought to let it flourish in a country like ours. That said, I think there is a case for reasonably systematic communication with civil society groups, NGOs, working in particular areas. There used to be, and for quite a long time, there was maintained something called the Consultative Committee on something or other, but bringing together security, defence, international relations, development-focused NGOs around the country at least once a year for a really quite extended half-day dialogue with Foreign Minister and senior officials about sorts of current issues. And I do think that was very helpful in getting at least a better understanding and avoiding perhaps some of the gratuitous criticism that might otherwise have flowed at government. It was not a matter of censoring people, it's just a matter of saying, well, do you really understand what we are actually doing and why we're doing it? And by all means give us a hard time if you think we're getting it wrong, but at least understand what we're trying to do and how much of this is in sync with what you guys are trying to achieve as well. And I thought that was very productive, and God knows why recent governments have abandoned or not maintained that particular relationship, because I do think it can be helpful in just getting a little bit more of a sort of united presentational front on some of these issues. But to try to force that would be labour of Hercules and misconceived.
If I could add just one quick comment. It's very rare, I think, that you get a consensus on image building. But it does happen from time to time. For instance, when Australia hosted the Olympic Games, we had to show the world, give them a coordinated kind of image of Australia. I think that the opening and closing ceremonies of a major international event like that do require people to come together and agree to some extent, what kind of image they want to show the rest of the world. So that's quite a good way of looking at how a country in a coordinated way, which is not all the time, but sometimes they do want to present a coordinated image. And again, it's very interesting to look at how Beijing presented itself when it hosted the Olympic Games, and how London, faced with the impossibility of spending the same kind of budget, but just decided to take a completely different approach in telling the world what British culture and history were about. Yeah.
Thank you very much, members of the panel.
Thank you, Naren, and thank you to our panellists. Well, we've come to the end of our day, and thank you very much to everyone for attending. CHASS is about what makes us human, and I think the theme of civility has come and gone to show how that notion of civility is central to that constitution of ourselves as human as opposed to something else. I think what we've seen also, and the last panel really brought it into perspective, is the way in which civility is a function really of an interaction of several forces. The concerted action of concerned citizens to enlarge the moral scope of the state, the interventions and leadership of government when it's subject to transparency and criticism, and of course the law. What's also been, I think, coming up as a theme fairly constantly, and I have to say, Joe, the one thing I disagree with what you said, I think the internet is more than just volume and so forth, actually, is the role of new media, new social media. In a way, as I think Andrew would agree if he was still here, the historic identification of the traditional press and media as the fourth estate is in a sense the thing that ultimately dooms it, because it locks itself into a historic structure which is no longer relevant in a global world. Hence the blogosphere, hence the increasing primary of social media. And I think Mr. Howard is absolutely right. I remember 20 odd years ago sitting on a university committee where we were trying to agree the protocols that we were going to adopt for internet use for our students. We never had to do this. Yeah, exactly. And you can imagine what it was like. And none of us knew anything about this at all. But I think some of us had an inkling that this was going to be something quite new and something quite big. And I remember saying to the head of our IT department, who was chairing the committee, everything you've so far said is pretty much what the Pope said in about 1580 about the printing press. It's the same as Napoleon and hard power. And, you know, we're not going to be able to control this in that way. What we can actually, and if we do try to control it, there'll be all kinds of unintended bad consequences to things we actually value and we don't really want to control. What we can do, though, is monitor it and understand it, which I think is probably where we need to be, bearing in mind that in a free society, which values freedom of speech and a free press, and as Mr. Howard said, I think the Larrikin Indian press is a signal example of in a sense, sort of the joys of a free society. At the same time, there are people who need protection, and we need to think about how we're going to do the checks and balances to do that. And that is also part of civility, I think. I'm now going to end on some really boring things. First of all, those who have got a yellow spot on your this one, that means you've if you haven't remembered, you've booked for the networking event, which is about to start. And so please just wait in the foyer until everyone's gone, and then drinks and canapes will be served. Don't forget to pick up your coat from the attendants outside the theatre. If it's as cold as it was this morning, you'll soon remember if you do. Finally, very importantly, just to thank the sponsors of this forum: gold sponsor, the Canberra University; silver sponsors, Macquarie University and the NTEU; and other sponsors and supporters, ANZOG and the Australian Sociological Association. And it only remains to me to thank our speakers, thank the CHASS office team who worked desperately hard to put this forum together in a very short time, and to thank you and to wish you a very safe journey home.